right, it looks like we're live. So, Dr. Ross, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, I'm an astronomer and a pastor, and I'm the founder of Reasons to Believe. I don't know how much more you want.
That's perfectly fine.
Okay.
So, I read your book, the way the universe is, why the universe is the way it is,
hmm
and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about fine tuning. Could you give us the audience a brief overview of what fine tuning is and why does it indicate a God?
Well, fine tuning simply refers to how you have to have certain features of the universe and the physics, our Earth and life, within narrowly defined ranges in order to make possible the existence of even the most primitive life, but especially human life. And it's at different points. I mean, the fine tuning you need is dramatically greater for plants and animals than it is for microbes, and dramatically greater for humans than it is for animals, but especially dramatically greater if you want to have billions of humans able to come into a redemptive relationship with the creator of the universe. That's where you see the greatest requirement for fine tuning design.
But why does it indicate the existence of a God? It just means it's improbable that that would occur by chance, right? But why would that indicate a designer?
Well, it indicates a personal designer, and that in the fine tuning, you see purpose, specified purpose. In other words, that you see that the universe has been designed to make possible a home for human beings, and not just a place where we can dwell, but that we happen to be at the just right location within the universe, existing at the just right time in the history of the universe, where we humans can actually observe 100% of the history of the universe, which indicates that the causal agent behind all this must have had some intent or desire that we humans would be able to access all this information about the universe and draw the appropriate philosophical conclusions. So, yeah, the universe is not just to provide us with a home, it's to provide us with an ability to learn certain things about the universe, to draw philosophical implications from that, and to recognize that the universe was actually designed with redemption in mind. I mean, when I first picked up a Bible in my late teenage years, what I noticed is all the biblical creation texts link the doctrine of creation with the doctrine of redemption. In fact, you'll find Bible passages that say that God begins his works of redemption before he creates anything. And that's something we've been researching at Reasons to Believe, discovering that every component of the universe, Earth and Earth's life, and every historical event in the universe's history, Earth's history, life's history, plays a role in making possible the redemption of billions of human beings from their propensity to commit sin and evil. And recognizing that when we look at the design features of the universe, it speaks of a God that wants a loving relationship with us. So this means we're not just talking some kind of transcendent causal agent. It's a personal being that's got specific purposes for creating the universe the way he did.
What is it about the universe that indicates the designer as opposed to it just coming about by random chance? What is it when we look at the universe that we see that indicates the purpose?
Well, I mean, when people were first discovering some of these fine-tuned features, they were asking that question. Maybe this is just a chance coincidence. And if we're talking one or two features, you might chalk it up to a chance coincidence. But when you got thousands of features, and when you see some of them with a fine-tuning range that's far more spectacular than anything we human beings are capable of, I think what impressed me is looking at things like the mass density of the universe, the dark energy density, and realizing that both of those features of the universe are fine-tuned to a degree that exceeds by many, many orders of magnitude the very best example of human engineering design and creativity. I mean, for example, with dark energy, the level of fine-tuning design you see there is a factor minimally of 10 trillion, 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 trillion times better than anything we humans are capable of manufacturing, which would imply that the causal agent that's behind the universe at a minimum, is that many times more intelligent than we human beings are. That many times, that many times more intelligent, that many times more knowledgeable, that many times more powerful and caring than we human beings. And so that tells us that must be a personal being, because only a personal being can manifest the attributes of intelligence, knowledge, creativity, and power.
So when you say it's many, many, many times like less probable than what we can do now, does that just mean it's really improbable? It's like just a, is that
Well,
just
I'll give you an example. Most of my physics peers would consider the epitome of human creativity and engineering achievement is the LIGO instrument. It's a gravity wave telescope that has the capacity to make measurements less than a tenth the diameter of a proton over 4 kilometers length. And we humans, I mean, that is the epitome of any measuring instrument we've ever come up with. But when you compare the fine tuning that was put into those that gravity wave telescope with what we see in just one or two features of the universe, this tells us, hey, as smart as we are, as intelligent and as inventive as we are, it's nothing compared to the causal agent that brought this universe into existence. And again, I'm just addressing one feature of the universe. There's thousands of features that show a level of fine tuning design that far exceeds anything we human beings are capable of. Excuse me, that's somebody left their phone here. I'll be right back. Sorry for that rude interruption.
no problem? So why can't the fine tuning just be explained by undiscovered laws of nature? Like we discovered that the weak and the electromagnetic force are actually the same force at high enough temperatures. Couldn't all the forces be interconnected in the same kind of a way?
Well, every force of physics shows a level of fine tuning design that exceeds anything we human beings are capable of. People have toyed with the idea maybe there's more than just four fundamental forces of physics. Maybe there's a fifth force of physics. All of our attempts to try to discover that have failed. It really does look like there's just four. Moreover, as I've read the research papers that hypothesize a fifth force of physics, it would involve more fine-tuning design, not less. And so one of the big attempts today is to try to determine, is dark energy governed by one constant of physics, or is it two or three? In terms of the fine-tuning, it really doesn't matter. Whether it's one, two, or three, you're still going to have extraordinary fine-tuning. And that's something my peers are discovering as we speculate about the physics we don't yet understand. What we're discovering is, yes, we can lower the fine-tuning design that we're measuring in some features of the universe, but we're just moving furniture. That fine-tuning design inevitably pops up and often pops up in a stronger way in the areas where we're speculating. So I don't know of any physicist or astronomer who thinks the fine-tuning evidence is going to decrease. In fact, when I speak on university campuses, I'll review the fine-tuning evidence, but actually show them the history story of how that fine-tuning evidence for the specific benefit of us human beings has accumulated with respect to time. And at a minimum, it gets a factor of 1,000 times stronger per month, which means I can share with skeptics, if you're not convinced today, wait 1 month and see what happens as we discover more about the universe. But yeah, over the last 40 years, it's been going up by at least a factor of 1,000 times per month. So this is the reason why so many Christian apologists go to the fine tuning, because not only is it a very powerful piece of evidence for a personal God, it's an arena of research where the evidence gets dramatically stronger, literally with every day that goes by.
So the fine tuning is essentially the fact that the universe would have to be is only one of many, many, many possible ways that could allow for life. It has to be very specific in the way that it's organized in order to allow for life. But wouldn't that same thing also apply to a god? Whereas a god would have to have a very specific kind of properties to create a universe like this one. And if it had any other different properties, then it may create a different universe. Maybe a god would want a black hole universe, or a universe with no people, or a universe with just hydrogen atoms. So it seems like the properties of a god have to be equally or more fine-tuned to be such a way that it would create this kind of a universe, wouldn't it?
Well, that's a response I frequently encounter, and you actually see that in some of the books by non-theistic atheists. They'll say, "Well, I mean, I think probably the most famous example is Richard Dawkins, who says, okay, we have all this fine-tuning evidence for our existence, but wouldn't the creator need to have even more fine-tuning evidence? In other words, if your God created the universe, who created God?" And my response to that is it's a category error. That when we look at the universe and us human beings, we're constrained by the physics of the universe. We're constrained by the space-time dimensions of the universe. But in physics, we have these space-time theorems, which basically establish, on the condition that we live in a universe that expands over time, and only such a universe will permit the existence of life. With that one assumption, we can prove that space and time were created, that space and time have a beginning that matches the beginning of the universe, which means that the causal agent for the universe must be a being that's not constrained by one dimension of time and three dimensions of space, not constrained by gravity, electromagnetism, and thermodynamics. And so what you'll see in both Why the Universe is the Way It Is and another book I wrote, Beyond the Cosmos, is based on these space-time theorems. It implies that the causal agent of the universe, at a minimum, has a capacity to operate in the equivalent of two independent dimensions of time. And therefore, if you've got God operating in a plane of time rather than just a line of time, that God could move and operate on a timeline infinitely long that never crosses or touches the timeline of our universe, as such that God would have no beginning, no ending, would not be created. And what I found interesting when I went through the holy books of the religions of the world in my late teenage years, the Bible stood alone in making that claim about God. No beginning, no ending, uncreated. It was also the only holy book that said that God can arbitrarily expand time or compress time. You see it in passages like Psalm 90. A day of the Lord is like 1,000 years to God. 1,000 years is like 3 hours in the night to God. And what I show in Beyond the Cosmos, mathematically, that's only possible for a being that's got access to at least two dimensions of time. In one dimension of time, you can't arbitrarily compress and expand time, but you can in two or three. And so that really answers the question, who created God? If he's not constrained to a single dimension of time, he need not be created. So,
Well, I mean, couldn't we say the same thing about the universe? We could say that there is a naturalistic law that is outside of space and time that is essentially eternal in that same sense. Like, for example, Nima Arkani Hamad and Sean Carroll argue that space and time are emergent from more fundamental natural forces. So it could be the case that there is an eternal natural thing instead of an eternal God that exists outside of space and time. And that
well, I've
thing,
read that. And, it's a good definition of God, what they're coming up with. They're basically saying there's something beyond the known physics that creates the universe. Well, that's a good dictionary definition of God. I mean, it's some entity outside the laws of physics that created everything. So, but I would go a little bit past what Sean Carroll is saying and saying not only is it something beyond the physics of the universe, it's a personal entity, because only a personal entity could fine tune to the degree that we see with the intended purposes that we can measure.
well, it seems to me that both the naturalistic hypothesis and the God hypothesis can both explain the fine tuning. You can say that God has such a nature that he would create a universe with beings, or you can say that the natural thing has such a nature that it would create the fine tuning in the way that it is for whatever reason, interconnected laws of physics. It seems like
Yeah, but
both.
here's the fallacy. It's not natural. If you're appealing to something outside the natural realm, by definition, it's not natural. And so
What do you
that's why
mean?
I'm saying they're conflating this hypothesized physics beyond the physics with God. I mean, God by definition is some causal agent outside of the physics and the dimensions of the universe. And, that's what these non theistic physicists are doing. They're appealing to what they claim is physics beyond our physics. But they're attributing to it creative agencies. I mean, it reminds me a lot of what you see in Romans chapter 1, that rather than crediting all this creative power to God, they're crediting it to the created order. And again, it raises the question, if you're going to appeal to something that's physical, like the physics of this universe, that's outside the space-time dimensions, where did that come from? Ultimately, you must have some causal agent that's not subject to what we would understand to be physics.
Well, yeah, I understand that they're going outside of the known physics, but they still seem to claim it's natural. They're both naturalists. They're not saying that it's non-natural, because I think the definition of natural doesn't entail space and time. It just entails um, parts of reality or something like that. It doesn't entail just known physics when you're talking about the natural.
Well, I'd be happy with that if they're actually appealing to reality, but they're not appealing to reality. They're speculating about stuff that's outside of known or measurable reality. And that's where they're getting into theology. I mean, I wish that they would admit that they're dealing, in metaphysics rather than physics. I mean, again, by definition, metaphysics is speculating about entities beyond the physics that we can measure. And, as I read Sean Carroll, he frankly admits this is stuff we can't measure. We can't detect, we can't measure. And if you look at Hebrews 11:3, it says the universe that we can detect did not come from that which we can detect. So kudos to Sean Carroll for actually parroting what we see in Hebrews 11:3.
Well, the difference, I think, is that in their models, they're only using combinations of known physics. So even though the combinations themselves can't be verified, all of the pieces can. So, for example, like the multiverse is a combination of early universe inflation and vacuum science. Both of those things can be verified, but the combination can't be verified. So I think that the physics is more strongly supported in that sense because it's already only using pieces of physics that can be verified, as opposed to like theology, which is adding things like eternal, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, these kinds of things. But those aren't combinations of known physics, as opposed to like the multiverse, which is a combination of known physics.
Right. No, that there I think is a more typical way of where non-theists go, rather than trying to appeal to some unknown exotic physics that's unlike anything that we can measure. They appeal to the multiverse. And so that's by far the most common response I get to the fine tuning is people say, well, hypothetically, there could be an infinite number of universes. Hypothetically, each universe in that infinite set could be different from other sets, not just different in terms of its internal properties, but its external properties, including the laws of physics. And they would point out in such a scenario, everything that we can hypothesize will happen. However, there's a philosophical flaw in that whole line of reasoning, one that was first pointed out by the atheistic physicist Leonard Susskind. And he basically wrote a paper where he said, we atheists have got to stop appealing to the multiverse because it explains everything. And an hypothesis that explains everything really explains nothing. Now that's where he stopped. What I've done in my book, The Creator and the Cosmos, 4th edition, is to give you an example of what I think Leonard Susskind was referring to. That if you've got an infinite number of universes where you've got an infinite variety of properties being manifested, in such a scenario, you'll get an infinite number of planets just like planet Earth. And you'll get an infinite number of varieties of tree species on those infinite number of Earths. Matter of fact, you'll get an infinite variety of birch tree species. And birch trees have the property that they peel white pieces of bark. If you've got an infinite variety of birch tree species, you're going to get one species that's going to peel very thin pieces of a white bark that are rectangular that measure 8.5 by 11 inches. And those pieces of white bark are going to fall on soil with random chemicals in it. And those random chemicals will do random imprints on those pieces of white birch bark that are falling on the soil. And with an infinite number of universes, you're going to wind up with a pile of 8.5, 11 pieces of white birch bark, very thin, that have imprinted on them all the equations, diagrams, figures, paragraphs that you see in every scientific research paper published by every research scientist in the world, which means those research papers didn't come from the minds of those scientists. The multiverse did it. And so what Leonard Susskind is pointing out is that if you're going to appeal to the multiverse to get rid of fine tuning by God, by the same stroke, you get rid of all fine tuning, including all the fine tuning we humans produce. So you're basically exposing that there's a philosophical inconsistency in the atheist's appeal to the multiverse. But I've also argued in my book that there's a positive way you can put this, that if the atheists are right about the multiverse, you're going to reach a point in our discoveries about the universe where the fine-tuning evidence, instead of rising exponentially, eventually will plateau, flatten, and begin to drop. So we just need to keep measuring the universe. And again, I can give you an analogy. You could see a coin being flipped, and you notice it keeps coming up heads every single time. What if it comes up heads 10,000 times in a row? Now, you could say, well, if there's an infinite number of coins being flipped by an infinite number of people, surely one of them is going to produce 10,000 consecutive heads. On the other hand, before I would bet tails on the next flip, I would want to look at both sides of the coin, or I'd want to make some measurements of the coin to see if it's been designed to gravitationally always fall head side up. We can do the same thing with the universe. We can choose to measure the universe in more detail than we've measured it so far. And in measuring in more detail, we see that the fine-tuning evidence continues to rise and continues to show specific purposes for the benefit of us human beings that argues in favor of a theistic interpretation of the universe and against the atheistic multiverse. Now, having said all that, my colleague here at Reasons to Believe, Jeff Zwirink, has written a book on the multiverse where he points out you can frame the multiverse from a Christian theological perspective. And when you do that, you can build a contradiction-free model. But when you try to build it from a non-theistic perspective, inevitably you're stuck with internal contradictions.
Right, my point wasn't to argue for the multiverse there. It was just saying that all of the secular versions of physics, all they're doing is making combinations of verified principles, particles, and laws in the field of physics. They don't add anything new, they're just combining it in different ways, as opposed to the theistic model where they're adding things that aren't in physics, like all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. Those are not properties of physics. You can't get those by combining principles, particles, and laws in physics. Whereas you can get the multiverse by combining principles, particles, and laws in physics. So it seems to me that the physics models seem to be more supported than the theistic models because they're only combinations of known physics, even if those combinations themselves can't be verified.
Yeah, but you do run into these philosophical dilemmas. And that's the problem. That's why you got people like Leonard Susskind saying, this is a bad thing for us atheists to pursue. And I remember back in the 1980s, I was predicting that eventually the fine-tuning evidence would become so strong that non-theistic scientists would have no choice but to speculate an infinite number of universes, all with different properties. And notice that's exactly what's happened. At the turn of the century, they became aware, wow, this evidence is continuing to accumulate at a dramatic pace. We got nowhere else to go to defend our non-theism except to hypothesize an infinite number of chances. But I remember even back in the 1990s and 2000, atheistic scientists saying, we really shouldn't go down that path. It's really a weak argument for us to appeal to an infinite number, because if you're going to appeal to infinity, you can explain anything you want. You can even find a universe where you don't have any debt.
Right, I agree. That's why I don't like string theory. But my argument is just that instead of going with the multiverse, we could just say that all of the constants of the universe are interconnected. So they must necessarily be the way they are, because if you change any of them, the other ones are also going to change proportionally. Like if we change the weak force, we'll also change the electromagnetic force because they're the same force. So if all the forces are interconnected by some unknown force, then the universe must necessarily be this way. So I'm not appealing to a multiverse. I'm just appealing to a determined universe. Isn't that a natural possibility?
But you're appealing to something unknowable. I mean, that immediately puts you outside of physics into metaphysics. You're appealing to something beyond the space-time realm of the universe, beyond the physics of the universe. Like it or not, it's metaphysics.
Oh, right,
And so,
absolutely. But isn't that how is that different from a God? Because I can propose a natural explanation of the fine tuning in this way, just like you can propose a God explanation. Why are those not equivalent explanations?
well, for example, what I see these physicists trying to do is trying to reduce everything to physics and chemistry. And so, yeah, they're appealing to something outside of the universe that is physics and chemistry, different physics, but basically in the same realm as physics and chemistry, on the assumption that everything in this universe can be explained by physics and chemistry. Now, I think you can explain things like how stars form, how planets form by just using physics and chemistry. Uh, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness, the origin of sex, the origin of the spirituality of human beings. These are challenges. So there's many things that we study in science where physics and chemistry does not provide us not only with an answer, it doesn't even provide us with a scenario. I've got 50 books in my office written by non-theists trying to explain the origin of consciousness. The one thing they agree, by the time they write their 3, 4, or 500 pages, they basically end up by saying, we haven't got a clue. The reason they don't have a clue is they're trying to find the answer to the origin of consciousness by only appealing to physics and chemistry. It also explains to me why these people who are physicalists are basically trying to figure out, okay, how does the mind work? And then they realize, okay, the brain has the hardware capability to explain the memory functions, but it doesn't explain the apparent ability of the human mind to program. Our brain is not just hardware, it's software. There's a programmer there. There's consciousness embedded in there. And they're trying to explain how that all comes about, or the origin of free will. What I'm seeing in a lot of these books I'm reading, trying to explain all of reality by physics and chemistry, they're basically forced to deny free will. They're basically saying everything that we do has been predetermined by the physics and the chemistry. But I think when you look at human nature, it's very difficult to deny that we possess free will. I don't think we're deterministically operating.
I mean,
And
I would agree with that, but I would say that there could be physics we haven't discovered yet. So couldn't we say that can't we appeal to an unknown natural physical thing that could explain, for example, consciousness or the origin of life or the origin of the universe or the fine tuning? Isn't that the same as appealing to a supernatural source? Just
that's also the same as what you see in Hebrews 11:3. The universe that we detect did not come from that which we can detect. We can detect matter, we can detect energy, we can detect space and time, but to explain the origin of space, time, matter, and energy, we're forced to appeal to something beyond space, time, matter, and energy. Now, I think a lot of this is semantics. I mean, I see my non-theistic physicist friends trying to claim, well, we agree with that, but we still think it's physics. I'm saying, well, let's get our dictionaries out and see what we're really dealing with, because that's not what my dictionary says. So sometimes I think we talk past one another because we're using different dictionaries.
well, I'm not sure what you mean by that because I don't think the dictionary determines reality. I think reality determines reality. So I think that it could be the case there is a God that caused the fine tuning. That's absolutely a possibility, and he's outside of space, time, and energy. But it could be the case that there's an unknown natural thing, which is also outside of space, time, and energy, and it could have created the universe. I don't see why. I mean, those both seem to be able to explain the fine tuning. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't think
I'm
that our
just
dictionary.
saying
What?
when you appeal to that kind of natural cause, it's functionally equivalent to the God that we Christians define. It's basically a God beyond space, time, matter, and energy. You can say, well, maybe there's some causal entity outside there. And that's the language I see some of my peers using. They won't call it God, but they'll call it a causal agent outside of space, time, matter, and energy that's got creative power. In fact, I can recall I gave a lecture at a government lab many years ago. I won't name the lab, but the director said, "This is a government lab. I forbid you to use the word God. You can't use the word God in this lecture." And I says, "Well, the Constitution gives me the right to do that." And he said, "I don't want you doing it. I don't care what the Constitution says." And I says, "Well, can I refer to the causal agent outside of space, time, matter, and energy that creates?" He says, "Fine, you can use that." But from my perspective, that just simply gave me an opportunity to define God every time I wanted to bring that issue up.
Well, when I'm talking about a natural thing, I'm talking about like a law of nature that has no consciousness to it. So it's just like a law like gravity. So it wouldn't be like a God in that kind of a sense because it has no consciousness.
Well, that raises the issue. How can a non-conscious physical law create beings that possess consciousness? I mean, you're basically violating the principle of cause and effect, that the effects can't be greater than the causes. And so I think that's a fundamental problem with atheism. They're trying to appeal to things that have no consciousness, no personality, no emotions, no intellect, no creative power, that creates beings that possess all of the above. And so, I mean, and a lot of them say, well, who cares about the principles of cause and effect? The problem is all of science critically depends on the principles of cause and effect. If you're going to abandon that, then you really are walking down the area of saying maybe the whole universe is an illusion. Maybe there's no reality out there. Maybe we're being fooled by some sophisticated hologram. And I run into non-theists who make those kinds of arguments, recognizing the dilemma that they're in trying to forget about the principles of cause and effect. They now fall into this category saying, well, it's Gnosticism. I mean, there is no physical reality out there. But all of our physics, all of our science tells us that the universe is real. And again, I have a hard time convincing my children that I'm not real.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that consciousness can be explained as an emergent property. Like, it seems to me like what you're saying is that consciousness can't come from non-consciousness. But that doesn't make any sense to me because that's like a composition division fallacy. We know that no hydrogen atom has the property of being a star, but if you put enough hydrogen atoms together, you'll get a star. So we can, things like no brick has the property of a wall, but if you put enough bricks together, you'll get a wall. No hydrogen and oxygen atom has the property of ocean, but if you put enough together, you'll get an ocean. So it seems like we can have non-conscious things that can combine in such a way to produce consciousness as an emergent property. I don't seem that wouldn't violate anything in science as far as I'm aware. And
No,
it
but
seems
here's the fallacy in that line of argument. A brick and a wall are fundamentally the same. They got the same physical properties. A wall is just a bunch of bricks that's been put together. To make the analogy work, you'd have to say, well, you start with a brick and you wind up with a human being. But I don't know anybody who claims that you can start with a bunch of bricks and wind up with animals and human beings. And that's kind of the point I'm making. There's a fundamental difference between something that possesses zero consciousness, no personality, no emotions, no intellect, no memory, no knowledge, and that's able to produce things that has all those properties. And so I like the analogies you gave, but they're basically in the same category. My whole point is consciousness is in a different category than physics and chemistry. And as evidence for that, I would appeal to all these books I own written by non-theists. I mean, they're trying to explain consciousness by physics and chemistry, but every book I got, the author ends up by saying, I have failed. I can't do it. I mean, the closest one I saw was books written by Roger Penrose, the British physicist, where he tried to claim that consciousness emerged from quantum microtubules inside the cell. But those books got significant review, basically saying, "Hey, you're appealing to these microtubules. It's and quantum mechanics. You simply can't explain consciousness from such simple entities." that it was critiqued by going to something that was actually much simpler than what we see, say, operating in the brain.
Well, for example, like hydrogen, if you have one hydrogen atom, it's pretty much inert, but if you put thousands or millions of hydrogen atoms together, it becomes a very reactive substance. And then, so it seems like just by adding more hydrogen atoms, you can get a new property which the single hydrogen atom doesn't have on its own. So I don't see that as being a problem. Even if we can't explain how yet, it doesn't mean it can't be done.
Yeah, but when you're appealing to hydrogen atoms to make a star, you've got thermodynamics going in a way where entropy increases. And that's been a test of a lot of these hypotheses. Is it consistent with the second law of thermodynamics? So again, starting with physics and chemistry and trying to emerge out of that things like personality, emotions, consciousness, the capacity to think, you're basically pushing a ball uphill, not downhill.
Well, putting consciousness aside for the moment, even if we don't explain consciousness, we can still explain the fine tuning of the universe. We can still explain the constants without the consciousness purely by naturalistic forces. We don't need consciousness to explain those, do we?
Well, I think we do in the sense that the only appeal I've seen to bypass some kind of personal entity is the appeal to the multiverse and say, well, it's just by pure chance we have all these properties. And, I've already pointed out that leads to philosophical inconsistencies. Moreover, it doesn't explain the purposes we see behind the fine tuning. I did have a debate with Victor Stenger when he was still alive on this issue, and he was claiming, well, I can easily imagine a totally different set of fine-tuned features for a different kind of life form. He says, what if we're not dealing with carbon-based life? What if we're dealing with life that is basically not subject to the physics of the universe? And I said, well, I totally agree with that. I think you could come up with a different set of fine-tuned features that would be fine-tuned for a completely different kind of life form. Matter of fact, I argue that's exactly what the Bible teaches, that God indeed has created a different fine-tuned realm for the angels. Angels are not carbon-based life, but they're like us human beings, they're complex. And because of their great complexity, they require fine-tuning just like we do, but it's a different kind of fine-tuning. And my whole point here is you can't just isolate the fine-tuning to get certain physical features. You got to ask the question, do we see specified purposes behind the fine-tuning? If you see specified purposes, then that testifies of a personality that's behind all this.
Well, my hypothesis wasn't the multiverse. It was just that the universe is determined that all the laws are interconnected. And it seems like an unconscious interconnected law could explain the fine tuning just as well as a God. But you said the specified complexity or something. How do you identify specified complexity?
I'm not talking specified complexity. I'm talking specified purposes.
Specified
I mean,
purposes. My
that term
apologies.
specified complexity is used by some Christian theists, basically making the point that we see greater fine-tuning specificity for human beings than we do for a bacterium, which leads to the suggestion that maybe there's some higher purpose for humans than there is for the bacteria, or for the fact that we need all the bacteria to be just exactly the way they are for humans even to be possible. And we need the bacteria to be there for 3 billion years before we have animal life. Animal life can't exist without it. So there really does seem to be a progression in creation history. Yes, the universe is created and designed to make possible microbes, but the fine-tuning evidence dramatically rises when you put it in the context of humans. And I argue it dramatically rises in the context of a God that wants to permanently eradicate evil and suffering for human beings. And so that's what I mean by specified purpose. So it's not just specified complexity, although I'd argue that is a good argument for theism. But when you combine it with specified purpose, then I think that really does force you to conclude, yes, there may be some physical entities outside the universe, but it's all governed by a personal being. There is a personal being behind it in some way, shape, or form.
So what
So
is
keep in
specified
mind,
purpose? How do you
or-
identify specified purpose?
well, the very fact that every feature of the universe and every event in the history of the universe, and that also applies to the Earth and the billions of years of life on planet Earth, the fact that all of it shows fine-tuned characteristics that makes possible the redemption of billions of human beings from their propensity to commit sin and evil, and how that redemption can be achieved in thousands of years rather than millions or billions of years. Now we're seeing very specified purpose for the universe. And so that would indicate that there must be a being outside the universe who designed the universe for that very purpose. He's got a goal in mind. So it's not just physics and chemistry randomly putting out something, let's see what happens. It's And again, I mean, people look at the Big Bang as a chaotic explosion. It's not a chaotic explosion. I mean, the expansion of the universe is one of the most finely tuned entities that we can measure that makes possible our human existence. So again, if it was just a mindless physical causal entity out there behind it, I would expect to see a lot more chaos in the universe than I see, and I wouldn't expect to be seeing all this specified purpose. And so the fact that the universe is so highly ordered and ordered for specific purposes, and the purposes are actually focused on us human beings, which is the unique life feature in the universe that can actually measure the universe to discover there's purpose there. I mean, dogs and cats can't do this. And we human beings are the only ones that have the power to actually measure the universe and try to discern the features that it has. I mean, I'm amazed that we human beings have such high motivation to discover these things. Why would we be so motivated to engage in theology and philosophy and science if indeed there wasn't a being outside of all this that had purposes in creating us, that wanted us to be able to make these measurements and make these discoveries? You know, I think what also helps the fine-tuning argument from a theistic perspective is what we astronomers have discovered. If we were placed here in the universe any earlier in cosmic history, we'd only be seeing part of the history of the universe. And that's because it takes time from the radiation from the cosmic creation event to travel on the surface of the universe and reach our telescopes. So, for example, if we were placed here 5 billion years ago, we'd only be seeing 2/3 of the history of the universe. And because of dark energy, if we were placed here any later, the universe would now be expanding at greater than the velocity of light, which again would mean we wouldn't be able to access the radiation from the cosmic creation event. So the fact that we're at this one time where we can measure 100% of the history of the universe at least suggests that there's a being behind the universe that wanted us humans to have the capacity to read the whole book of the universe. And I think what makes that especially a potent argument, we're also living at the only location in the universe where it's possible to measure 100% of the history of the universe. When you think of how vast this universe is, 200 billion galaxies, 50 billion trillion stars, why is it that we humans are orbiting the one star in this vast universe where we got a window where we can measure 100% of the history of the universe? Now, I've run into some of my non-theistic colleagues who say maybe it's a sheer coincidence that we astronomers here at just the right time in cosmic history, but we're also here at the one location. And so, again, you might attribute one of these to a coincidence, but when you got hundreds of features like this, you begin to realize this isn't just chance. And
What do you
again,
mean
I
by
think
the one location? Because from my understanding, any part of the universe is essentially the center of the universe. We can see most of it, pretty much all of it, from anywhere. What do you mean we could only see it from here?
well, if we were near the center of our galaxy, the density of stars and the density of molecular clouds would be such that most of our view of the universe would be blocked. We'd only be able to see part of it. And I should add one caveat. I'm talking about life conceivable locations. Because, yeah, you could put us in one of the cosmic voids, but life is not possible in a cosmic void. So, in all the life conceivable locations of the universe, we're at that one spot where we can actually access 100% of the history of the universe. I got a whole chapter on why the universe is the way it is, kind of making that point that, hey, if you had Mercury and Venus switch places, it would significantly damage our capacity to make astronomical observations. Put us anywhere except the inside part of the co-rotation distance in our galaxy, our capacity to observe our galaxy and the rest of the universe would be substantially hampered. I'm not saying we wouldn't see anything, but we wouldn't be able to see 13.8 billion years of cosmic history, measure it in sufficient detail that we can discover the properties of the being that brought the universe into existence. And that's kind of the Christian worldview perspective, is that God put us at a time and a place where we can not only discover that there must be a God behind all of this, but we can actually determine several of the attributes of that God. And that wouldn't be possible if we weren't where we are in the time that we are with the resources that we have. I mean, that to me is another argument. We're in this amazing planet that's unlike any other planet in the universe, a planet that gives us the resources to develop the technology to be able to gain the knowledge base that we humans have. And again, that tells me that there must be a being outside the universe that wanted us to be able to gain all that knowledge. Otherwise, why put us on a planet with 630 times as much thorium as other rocky planets, or 340 times as much uranium? I mean, one of the things that amazes me, I put this in my book, Improbable Planet. Pick any element in the periodic table, and Earth is anomalous, not by a little bit, but by a wide margin. And moreover, 22 of the elements in the periodic table are vital poisons. If the quantity were slightly greater, we'd all be dead. If the quantity were slightly less, we'd all be dead. And you look at any other planet, and those 22 vital poisons are all in the wrong abundance levels for advanced life. I mean, no matter where you go in the sciences, you find arguments like this. And I think that's a powerful argument for a Christian theistic worldview perspective. Pick any scientific discipline, dive into it deeper than we already have, and you're going to come up with mind-blowing new scientific evidences for the God of the Bible. And I'm even seeing this in the writings of scientific research papers by my peers who are not theists. They'll say things, well, when we look at the deep carbon cycle, it's clear that there must be some very clever demon behind it all that's adjusting all the dials to make things just right so we could be here. So, or they'll say, all this fine-tuning design we're seeing in the formation of the moon, boy, it really gives us pause and causes us great philosophical disquiet. So the fact that they're actually putting this kind of philosophical and theological language into the research papers. I mean, I remember a past issue of Nature talking about the origin of life, where one of the scientists said, we are committing the hand of God dilemma every time we try to do a simulation experiment for the origin of life in the lab. And what he meant by that is, we have to put in all this laboratory control and to an extreme degree in order to get these results. This would never happen in the real world. What we're doing is behaving like God behaves. We come in, we engineer, we control, we have to put in a lot of our intelligence and knowledge to make things just right. And so he was actually appealing in this article in Nature that we origin of life researchers should at least tell the reader how many times we're committing the hand of God dilemma when we do these simulation experiments. And he said, if we're honest, we're committing it at least a dozen times.
So a couple things on that was, one is, suppose we discover the multiverse is true. Would that, and that we don't see the absolute beginning of the universe, would that convince you that, or make it less likely that the universe is fine-tuned because we don't see all the way back to the ultimate beginning?
Well, as a number of scientists have pointed out, all these multiverse theories are still subject to the space-time theorems. They don't get rid of God. At best, they lower the degree of personality that you need to explain all these features of the universe. However, I still think Leonard Susskind's onto something. If you're going to try to appeal to a multiverse to get around all this intelligence and knowledge from this hypothesized God, you also wind up eliminating all the fine-tuning thought and design of every human being that's existed here on Earth. So you do run into a philosophical inconsistency when you do make those kind of multiverse appeals. Now, as a Christian, it wouldn't bother me if we discover that there's lots of universes beyond our own. We don't know how many universes God created. We do know he created other realms. He's got a different realm for the angels. So if there's a whole bunch more, that wouldn't disturb my theology. What would disturb my theology is if we were able to come up with incontrovertible physics proof that the universe had no kind of a beginning. Because that seems to be foundational to Christian theism, that the universe has a beginning. The Bible repeatedly claims that there's a God who's personally responsible for bringing the universe into existence. In fact, one public debate I had with an atheist chemist, it's Peter Atkins, and you can get it online. I was asked by the moderator, are there any discoveries in science that would cause you to abandon your Christian faith? I says, yeah, there are several. I mean, I was making the point that Christianity is falsifiable. One reason why it's a scientific model, it's falsifiable, it has explanatory power, it makes predictions. That's how we judge scientific models. And if you've got a philosophical system that's not testable, it's not falsifiable, it's not predictive, then I would argue, well, you can't disprove it, but you can't prove it either. And so if your model has no possibility of being proven wrong, I don't think it's of much value. But if you watch that debate, what you'll notice is that Peter Atkins could not offer any discovery in science that would ever cause him to abandon his atheism. In fact, he said, even if God were to appear right in front of me as a being and tell me he was God, I would think I was having an hallucination. And so I found that ironic because for a whole hour he claimed we have to base our belief systems on scientific evidence. But when push came to shove, scientific evidence evidently didn't make any difference for him.
Right, I would agree. I would think that if you can make novel, testable predictions that come true repeatedly, that is good evidence of a God. So
Right,
if I pray
right.
to a God and a gold brick appears in front of me every time, that's good evidence of a God. I'm going to accept that. But what is there something that, from my perspective, I agree with the Leonard Susskind quote that if you have a theory that can explain anything, then it explains nothing. And so, from my perspective, theism is kind of like that, where it can just explain anything. Anything that we see around us could just be explained or reinterpreted as a different interpretation of what God did, and just essentially just not take the Bible literally or just interpret it in a more general sense. You can get anything you want pretty much. So, like, if there's an all-powerful being, he could explain any way the universe is, not just this way. It doesn't need to be this way, because any change could also be explained by a God.
Well, when I look at the Bible, it seems to be very specific about history, geography, and science. And I would expect if this book really is inspired by a God that created the universe, then what it communicates to us about science, history, and geography is not going to be filled with errors. It's going to be correct. I would also anticipate that if this is really from the creator of the universe, it's going to have predictive power. And that's kind of how I became a Christian. I was not raised in a Christian home, but looked at these holy books after I became convinced through my astronomy that the universe had a beginning, which implied a beginner. But that's what I looked for. I said, okay, if this is really from the creator of the universe, it's going to be inerrant in what it communicates about science, history, and geography, and it's going to demonstrate predictive power. And therefore, I'd argue, yeah, you could interpret the Bible in a very metaphorical, figurative way where you can make it say anything you want. But that's not the language of the Bible. I've looked at other holy books where I would agree, yeah, it's written in such esoteric poetry that you can make it say anything you want. But that's what impressed me about the Bible. Most of it is prose, most of it is highly didactic in what it's teaching. It's very specific and detailed on physics, geometry, and history. The other thing that impressed me was how many times it commanded me to put everything to the test. And so this idea of testability flows right out of the Bible. I was also impressed that the biblical creation text followed the scientific method. Years later, that there was a good reason for that. That's where the scientific method came from. And so when I see the Bible predicting future scientific discoveries, when I see it predicting future historical events and the affairs of human beings, this tells me this isn't just coming from the mind of a human being. This is actually inspired by the one that created the whole universe and actually has the intended purposes that are declared in the pages of the Bible. So I would dispute the idea you can make it say anything you want. The specificity basically argues against that, and especially the predictability. And so that really impressed me, the fact that the Bible accurately predicts hundreds of times future historical events and future scientific discoveries. I mean, to be honest, that's what brought me to the Christian faith, is seeing that predictive power.
Yeah, I would totally agree that if it did do that, that would be good evidence. But when I read the Bible and when I look at the interpretations of most like historians and biblical scholars and other people in other fields like biology and physics, it seems like they see errors, lots and lots and lots of errors in the way the Bible describes reality. So why do you think it's not the case that like how do you get your interpretation is the correct interpretation as opposed to all these others which seem to suggest there are lots of errors in the Bible?
Well, whenever people tell me there's errors in the Bible, I say, well, show me one. And every time I've done that with a skeptic, they come up with something that doesn't show to be accurate. Now, to put that in context, it's easy to critique any book if you put it in the worst possible interpretive light. That was not my approach. When I looked at the Hindu Vedas, the Quran, the Buddhist commentaries, a lot of the Chinese writings and the Bible, I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put each book in the best possible interpretive light. But for example, when I did that with the Hindu Vedas, there was no way to escape the fact that it had many provable errors in it. Likewise, with the Mormon scriptures, for example, a lot of false prophecies that clearly did not come true, even in the best possible interpretive light. But when I put the Bible in the best possible interpretive light, I can't find a single evidence for a provable error. And I can find lots of places where it got the future history right and the future science right. It never got it wrong. So,
Well, just thinking about like Bart Ehrman is a world-renowned expert in New Testament scholarly criticism. He identifies lots and lots and lots of criticisms where it's not possible for both of the statements to be true, so one of them has to be false. And I mean, many experts in the field seem to suggest that there are lots of errors in the Bible, but your interpretation is different from theirs. I mean, should we? But you're not an expert in biblical history, not a historiographer like they are. Should we take their position less seriously than yours?
well, I've watched lots of debates between Bart Ehrman and conservative theologians, and the conservative theologians always win the day. They're basically pointing out, okay, Bart, you can interpret it that way, but that's not how scholars have looked at the Bible over the centuries. And again, I think it's important to point out the Bible is not a single book, it's 66 books. And so the way you check your interpretation of, say, Matthew is to look at the other Gospels, look at the New Testament epistles, look at the Old Testament. It's not enough to take the Bible literally. We have to take it literally and consistently. I mean, as you're probably aware, if you Google my name, there's lots of Christians that disagree with my interpretation of the Bible. I mean, especially theistic evolutionists and young earth creationists. But the way I respond is say, you're cherry picking certain verses out of the Bible. If you're going to actually look at what the Bible says about creation, you need to look at all 24 plus lengthy creation texts in the 66 books of the Bible. And you need to use the principle of consistency. And you do that, you discover, for example, the young earth interpretation is incorrect. The Bible is not a young earth book. In spite of their protestations, all the answers are not in Genesis. There's 65 other books.
So you mentioned that there are some discoveries that could be made that would falsify Christianity. Could you name some in cosmology other than like the universe not having a beginning that would do that?
Well, yeah, we put a number of these on our reasons.org website. Probably the one that's got the most attention, especially at NASA, is a piece I wrote basically saying we need to go back to the moon because the Apollo missions were focused on recovering pristine lunar rocks, but we know there's a lot of Earth soil on the moon. In fact, 3 astronomers that I know published a paper where they calculated that on average there's 20,000 kilograms of Earth soil on every 100 square kilometers of the moon's surface. And 1 ton of Earth soil will have about 100 quadrillion microbes in it. Moreover, they showed that most of that soil got to the moon when the Earth was between 3.5 and 3.8 billion years old. And because of Earth's geology, we do not have the fossils of Earth's first life. But because of the rate at which meteors were transporting Earth's soil to the moon at that time, and the fact that the moon has almost no geological activity, we can expect to find pristine fossils of Earth's first life on the moon. And there's a lot of speculation about what those fossils will look like. Theists and non-theists have very different expectations of what those fossils will look like. I got to speak at NASA Houston on this topic and said, we can go back to the moon and we can prove whether the theists got it right or the non-theists got it right. And last time I checked, theists and non-theists made up 100% of the US taxpayer base. So everybody should be excited about going back to the moon and see who got it right. I mean, that's just one of many examples I could give you of things we don't yet know that we have the potential of discovering that have theological implications.
What's the difference in that? What is the different prediction made between theists and non-theists about what the early fossils are going to look like?
Well, non-theists, and they published this, is that they would expect that the fossils of Earth's first life will be no bigger than 1/10 of a micron, because in their naturalistic models, the first life has to be much simpler than the simplest microbes we see on the Earth today. They're predicting that it'll be a last universal common ancestor, namely that there will only be one microbe species from which all their microbes evolve. Whereas a Christian perspective based on Psalm 104 is that we have a God that's aggressively packing the planet with as much life as possible, as with as great a diversity as possible, for as long as possible. So in that expectation, we would anticipate that the first life would be a diverse ecology of microbes of all different sizes. We would expect that we would have multiple chemistries involved, including photosynthesis, given a God that wants to prepare the planet quickly for the entry of human beings. And again, quickly in an astronomical perspective, 3.8 billion years from my perspective seems super aggressive in terms of everything that needs to be done to get things ready for human beings. We'd also expect we're going to find a lot of microbes, not just 1 or 2 here and there, that if this indeed is the God of the Bible, we would expect the origin of life would be an abundance of microbes with many diverse species. Moreover, we'd expect that there'd be microbes there that would play a role in launching plate tectonics, because that's so important to get the planet ready fast enough for advanced life. So I'd be looking for different species of photosynthetic life, not just 1 or 2.
What do you mean microbes that launched plate tectonics?
Well, excuse me. This is something I put in my book, Improbable Planet, that we're discovering that the date for the origin of life is the same date for the launch of plate tectonics, in the sense that if you got photosynthetic life at 3.8 billion years ago, the oxygen from the photosynthetic life will precipitate uranium ores, which will move into the boundaries between plates that provides a heat source that sets up chemical reactions basically to manufacture lubricants that would enable these plates to begin to slide under one another. And there have been several papers published making how important it is to for photosynthetic life to bring these uranium precipitates into the subduction zones. And if you don't have the photosynthetic life, you're basically not going to get the quantity of uranium there that you need. And
Interesting.
basically explaining why plate tectonics has been long lasting on planet Earth. It's not just the heat flow from the uranium and thorium in the interior of the Earth, that's important. But in addition, we need heat from uranium to be on the surface of the Earth in the right location to make the plate tectonics operate at a highly efficient level. And this is why a number of researchers are pointing out Earth is the only place in the universe where we got long-lasting, aggressive plate tectonics. But you need that if you want to ever get human beings.
So if we discover that there are more of the laws are interconnected and like the weaken the electromagnetic force, would that mean that there is no fine tuning because it was all determined? Would that invalidate the fine tuning argument?
No, I think what you're doing is you're just simply moving the fine tuning around. And again, a number of my peers have written books on this, making the point, yes, we can conceive of ways in which instead of having all these different parameters, maybe we got fewer parameters, but the fewer parameters need greater fine tuning than the larger ensemble. So yeah, you can, it's kind of like, moving things around. You can shift the fine tuning from here to here, but you never get rid of the fine tuning. And usually when attempts have proven fruitful there, the fine tuning evidence has always gone up. It has not gone down. So yeah, my peers have looked for places where they can speculate about the physics in a desire to drive the fine tuning down. But again, if you read the scientific literature, it's always gone the other way. Yes, whenever we found a way to move the fine tuning, we wind up with more fine tuning evidence. We don't wind up with less.
Well, so if all of the universe was determined naturally, would that disprove fine tuning?
Well, if the universe were to be nothing but physics and chemistry within length, width, height, and time, that would be catastrophic to the Christian faith. Because, the Christian faith is really founded on the idea of a transcendent causal agent. So, yeah, if we were to find a way to explain it all internally, I think that would be very corrosive, if not catastrophic, to the Christian faith. But I see no prospect for that happening. I mean, hundreds of years of research, the evidence has always gone in the opposite direction. And I think that's really the way you put these philosophical ideas to the test. Because a lot of my non theistic peers will say, I'm not going to believe like you do until all the non theistic options are taken off the table. And I says, well, you're not taking into account that we humans are limited. We're constrained to the universe, and therefore it's impossible for us to learn everything that can conceivably be discovered about the universe, which means that we're never going to be able to close off all the loopholes. But this is what we can do. We can endeavor to learn more about the universe. And in learning more about the universe, if we see the evidence for a theistic causal agent goes up and not down, that's evidence in favor of theism and evidence against atheism. Will we ever get absolute proof? No. I mean, one of the articles I wrote on our website is basically making the analogy. I've been married for 42 years, but I still lack absolute proof that my wife exists. On the other hand, with every year I've been married, the practical evidence for existence goes up, it doesn't go down. But it's possible I've been fooled all these years by a very sophisticated three-dimensional hologram. However, I don't base my relationship with my wife on those kinds of speculations. I say, let's look at the evidence I do have. Does that evidence get stronger and stronger as I continue to relate to her and as I continue to observe the responses of other human beings to my wife. And the evidence has always gotten stronger, it hasn't gotten weaker. I think the same thing applies about how we scientifically test for God. Let's not try to find absolute proof, that'll never happen. And I'll never be able to back Sean Carroll, for example, into a corner where he's got no speculations. But I think what's interesting is his range of speculation possibilities gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we learn more and more. I think that tells us something.
Why do you think it is that most physicists are atheists if this is the case?
Well, the Bible tells us that the majority of human beings will want to be autonomous, which means they're not going to want to accept the fact that there's a God to whom we are subject, to whom we must obey. And so it's that autonomy that causes scientists, and not just scientists, but lots of human beings, to engage in self-imposed ignorance. We see what's real out there, but we choose not to accept the implications of what we know to be real. And so that tells me this is not just a matter of scientific evidence. We also have to look at the psyche of the human being. When I read Stephen Hawking, for example, what he wrote in A Brief History of Time, he says, my goal is to know everything that God knows. And I don't mean just all the physics of the universe. I want to know everything, like what's going to happen to all of us human beings in the future, what's going to happen to the universe in the future. I want to be as smart and as intelligent, as knowledgeable as God. Well, there's some theological issues with that. We are the created entity, not the creator. We're not as great as the one that created the universe. And so, but when you get these ideas into your head, it begins to cloud how you interpret the physics that you see. And that's something what I've noticed. A lot of my peers are very comfortable with deism. They're okay with a God that creates. They're not okay with a God that interferes with our human lives. And so, that whole idea of how we respond to God's desire to have some influence over our lives and our human propensity to be autonomous, I think needs to be taken into account. It's not just scientific evidence. And, we humans aren't always rational in the way we respond. For example, in a debate I did at Caltech at the International Skeptic Society conference, I ran into a lot of atheists afterwards who said, our issue is not with the God of the Bible, it's with his followers. Because it says, we don't hate the God of the Bible, but we despise his followers. And my response is, don't you think it's a little irrational to allow imperfect human beings get between you and a morally perfect creator? And they said, yeah, but you don't know what these people did to me. And so here we're getting into the issue of forgiveness. And this is something that's a core of the Christian faith, is that in order to come into a relationship with our Creator, it's necessary that we be able to forgive our fellow human beings. And often I run into people where they're just simply unable or unwilling to do that.
From my understanding, the reason most physicists don't accept the God hypothesis is because when you go outside of the known physics, you can essentially make up any way to explain what caused the fine-tuning, like the multiverse or string theory or physically determined things. You can make up lots of ways to explain the fine-tuning. And the reason physicists don't do that is because they only want to use combinations of known principles, particles, and laws in physics. They seem to prefer that than adding in other properties that aren't in physics.
Well, I would respond to that by saying we need to test everything. It's great an idea to suggest that. Let's put it to the test. That's a Christian principle. Everything must be tested. Only believe that which proves to be true and good. And so let's put all the models on the table. Well, let's rigorously put them to the test and see which one is gaining success and which ones aren't. And again, it's a pathway. We're not going to come up with absolute proof, but if we see that the anomalies are getting resolved and they're producing new anomalies that are at a lesser level than the anomalies we resolved, that's a strong indication we're on the pathway of truth. But if the anomalies are getting bigger and bigger and more numerous, then that's an idea that tells us we probably got the wrong model. I mean, I'm engaging origin of life researchers with that. I'm saying, notice from a non-theistic perspective, your anomalies are getting bigger and bigger and more numerous as we learn more and more about the origin of life. Usually in science, that's considered to be evidence that you got the wrong model. And why aren't you looking at the alternatives?
I'm not sure I would agree with that because I would think that when we learned about general relativity as opposed to Newtonian mechanics, the number of problems just escalated exponentially from Newtonian mechanics, which is just so simple compared to general relativity. So the fact that there's more problems, I don't think that's evidence it's less likely to be true. I think that's more likely we're in the right path to make it more complicated.
Well, I think I'm agreeing with you is that when we compare Newtonian mechanics to general relativity, the predictions of general relativity have been proven remarkably successful. I mean, it's passed every test thrown at it, and some of the cases it's passed the test to 20 places the decimal. Whereas when you do that to Newtonian mechanics, it's going the other way. Now, notice you still got people talking about modified Newtonian dynamics to try to explain certain features of galaxies. But if you read the scientific literature, it's not going too well for those models. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop speculating. I'm all in favor of saying, we need to continue to put general relativity to as rigorous a test as possible. But the track record of the past 50 years has been the more and more rigorously we try to test general relativity, the greater and greater success it shows. So, but I would argue we need to do that across the board in all the sciences. And one of the things that disturbs me, I see in the life sciences an unwillingness to actually investigate other models. They kind of like to stick to a certain class of models, and those are the only ones we're going to test. I like what happens in physics and cosmology. No matter how strange the model, you got the freedom to publish it, but we demand that it be put to a test.
Do you think that general relativity has been more successful than theism in its predictions?
General relativity is a theistic model. I mean, what's interesting is when general relativity was first proposed by Einstein, a number of his peers immediately saw the Christian implications of his theory, which is why they were very eager to reject general relativity. But eventually, the evidence became so strong that in spite of its Christian implications, it looks like we have to accept it. Because every time we tried to put it to the test, it's proven that test. I mean, it was general relativity that showed us the universe had a beginning. It was a space-time theorems based on general relativity that showed us that even space and time are created entities. So yeah, as a Christian, I'm really excited about general relativity. It's one of the best things that's happened to us.
But suppose, for example, Einstein said that general relativity explained all of the universe. We get like a theory of everything, like Hawking was looking for. At that point, because it made more testable predictions, wouldn't that make it a better theory than theism?
Well, if that were to happen, I mean, what happened with Einstein is he said, gee, we've got to get rid of this beginning. And so he threw a fudge factor into his equations to keep the universe eternal. But by the 1930s, he repented of that and said, that was the biggest mistake I made in my career. So that's another example where you can propose alternatives, but they got to be put to the test. And credit to Albert Einstein, he admitted that his speculated hypothesis didn't bear out under testing. His original theory did, however.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been really great talking to you. I'm getting hungry and my throat's kind of going out pretty bad right now. So,
no, you're raising great questions. I appreciate what you've done here. This has been really good. And I hope all this got recorded.
oh yeah, absolutely. It's being broadcast right now. Everybody's watching it. It's live. So,
Oh, good.
so thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me, and I'd love to talk with you again sometime. See
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, no, you've been a good host. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a nice night.
Okay, good. Take care.
See you later.
All right.